We're gearing up for a thrilling episode on swimwear just in time for summer. We'll be sharing essential tips on handling the tricky, stretchy parts of swimwear to ensure they stay put where you want them. We'll also explore sustainable swimwear fabrics and discuss how to choose and work with eco-friendly materials for your DIY project.
We will both discuss our experiences recently with making swimwear, noting there's always something new to learn. We'll also cover a popular item on every maker's wish list, the elusive dry robe. And in order to find out what in the world the dry robe even is, you'll have to wait until later in this episode.
Hello, and welcome to Threaded Together, a podcast that stitches together home sewing and high fashion. We're your hosts. I'm Tracy.
I'm Rebecca, and in today's episode, we'll be discussing swimwear. This is our 17th episode, or season 2, episode 5 for Threaded Together, and we are so excited to have you.
And we're thrilled to have you back listening to us again.
And don't forget to find us on social media at Threaded Together Podcast. You can see what we're working on and keep up with us between podcasts. Just give us a follow. This is going to be a really fun episode. I think this is the first time we've both made something specifically for an episode. Isn't that right, Tracy?
I think it might be, despite good intentions. So if you've listened to all the sewing podcasts that are out there about sewing, swimwear, and are thinking, what can you possibly add to the conversation? Don't worry. We've listened to them all too, and we have lots to say. We have our own experiences to share and lots of tips and tricks to share as well.
Absolutely. That being said, we need to cover some pop culture quickly, since in our last episode, we discussed the legacy of vintage garments and recreations as they pertain to the Met Gala. It was a fabulous episode, and we included some predictions on what people would wear. And since that event is now past, we need to circle back to see how we did at forecasting. So first, what we did not know at the time was the theme of the red carpet specifically was different than the main theme of the event. And for the red carpet, the theme was Garden of Time, which was based on the dystopian novel by J.G. Ballard. You would think with that theme, it would invite some non-groundbreaking florals for spring. And sadly, you would be right. But not all of our predictions were wrong.
Well, I mean, you could say that. You could argue that we got it right and all of the designers got it wrong. But there were definitely some looks that were worth celebrating. And there's a few favourites that I think we'd like to call out. So I want to start with Gigi Hadid. So she partnered with one of our favourite designers at the moment, Tom Brown, wearing a gown that was a beautiful off-the-shoulder corset dress under this silk white coat with this black tipping around the edge of the coat, and then it was covered in these beautiful yellow roses. So as I understand, it took a team of more than 70 people over 13,500 hours to make, which is incredible.
It was amazing.
And then Elle Fanning wore a glass gown dress by Balmain. And so if you can picture the scene from the 1950 Cinderella film where the birds create a dress for Cinderella and they're flying around her and creating this dress. And this was the reference for the dress. And so there's the birds above the shoulder representing the bow being added to the dress. And it's like this really beautiful reference to Cinderella, and it's just such a stunning dress.
It really was. Thank you for drawing even my attention to that one, because I do think it was one of those dresses where you saw it on the red carpet, it was lovely, but then on further inspection, it was just even more incredible.
Yeah, agreed.
And then another particularly striking piece that also only got more interesting the more we learned about it, I would say fell very much in line with our predictions. And that was, so pardon my lack of French pronunciation, but Isabelle Huppert is a French actress that wore a champagne-colored silk satin dress with an absolutely stunning train that spread out behind her on the red carpet as she walked. It was a breathtaking dress, but what made it even more intriguing was it was inspired by a dress created by Maison Callot-Sueur, a French fashion house started by her great-grandmother and her great-aunts. The original dress closes the exhibit at the Met, while the actress wore a recreation done by Demna for Balenciaga. And we'll link a good article and a fabulous behind the scenes video where Isabel talks about the dress and her incredible fashion heritage in the show notes. But that was an absolute showstopper and one of my favorites.
And it's definitely worth looking up the two dresses, the one she wore and the one in the exhibition, and just seeing the two beside each other is incredible.
Absolutely.
Then one more to call out was Nicole Kidman wore a recreation of a 1950s gown by Balenciaga, which is just a beautiful, beautiful dress.
It was stunning. And so there were quite a bit of recreations on the red carpet.
Mhm.
So I guess all in all, we were partially right, Tracy?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think so. We'll just applaud
Yeah,
ourselves on that.
absolutely. So I wanted to bring up this is kind of cliche, but the recent season of Bridgerton. But whether or not you like the show, the Regency era resurgence as a result of the show is a movement. However, that's not what struck me this season, and that's really what I want to talk about. Tracy, you and I
Mhm.
were both having a sewing weekend when it came out, and I swear I was messaging you every few minutes with photos. It took me at least 2.5 hours to get through the first episode. I just kept pausing it. I was so excited.
That's absolutely right. I thought it would make a nice bit of background viewing whilst I was sewing, but I actually had to stop the sewing to give it my full attention. It's just the costumes on it were absolutely
They
incredible.
really were. And I think our excitement stemmed from something unusual happening with some of the more secondary characters that was decidedly not Regency themed at all. For example, one
Mhm.
of the sisters, Eloise, had this fabulous Chanel moment in the first episode that had nothing to do with kind of what was happening in the storyline or with the time period, but was perfectly parallel to a Gabrielle Chanel independent woman vibe. I went so far as to ask if we thought the costume designer had gone to the recent Chanel exhibit because the dress, just everything about it just screamed Chanel and just seemed honestly so out of place in that moment. But I just loved it for what it potentially said about the character with the Chanel reference.
I mean, it's a British show. Maybe they had been inspired by the
Yeah.
V&A exhibit.
Yeah.
Another thing that really stood out to us was Cressida and her
Oh,
sleeves. They just got bigger and bigger and more spectacular with every every costume.
it was so fabulous. We would definitely recommend giving the first episode, even just that, a watch, if only for how modern some of the costuming is. I just about gasped when one of the characters was wearing a clear kimono inspired garment in their bedroom. It had a beautiful kimono front, but then ruche sleeves that gave it this very Balenciaga like quality. And it just made it such a delight to look at and really added dimension to an otherwise, I mean, I guess I would say kind of a ho-hum season in my opinion. And the last thought on this, we were wondering what changed to invigorate the, of course, polarizing non-period costuming. And Tracy, you found out something really interesting about one of the costume assistants.
Well, on Instagram, I follow Henry J. Wilkinson, who I 100% recommend you follow. He shares the most incredible details of absolutely beautiful vintage garments. For example, recently he shared the details of this Givenchy coat, similar to one worn by Audrey Hepburn in the film Charade. Anyway, he shared that he'd worked as a costume design assistant for John Glasser on the series of Bridgerton. And there's so many beautiful articles and behind the scenes details on the costumes that it's definitely worth having a look. And we'll share a link to one of them in the show note.
But our theory, Tracy, to clarify for everyone, is that this very modern take that doesn't really present on any of the primary characters, we are surmising is coming from this particular design assistant. Because I do believe at one point I said it felt like we were watching like a CSM graduate collection in the character of Cressida's outfits in the best way. It was just so high
Yeah.
fashion and just so forward looking and fabulous, and there were so many references. Yeah, it really was such a delight. Before we dive into our main topic, We have both made swimwear this past month, as we said earlier, but we both also did some additional making. So, Tracy, what else have you been working on in addition to your swimwear?
Well, all I have managed on top of the swimwear, which we'll get into later, is a dress, another fabric godmother peony
Mm,
dress. I did get some other projects cut out though, so I hope to make some more sewing progress over the next few weeks.
absolutely. And I'm very excited to see how this dress turns out since I know it's another ascot dress. In last episode, I said I wanted to kind of get back into sewing more, and I have some exciting news. I borrowed a friend's serger, finally. And what a transformation. I want to overlook everything. I did say I was going to make something following a pattern, and I'm excited to say I made the Fiber Mood Rhonda top out of a map printed silk. That blouse features a squared front and back panels, which made it a great fit for the dead stock printed silk paneled fabric. And it was an easy pattern to follow and a good first practical test run of the Overlocker.
Amazing. And yeah, once you've made friends with an overlocker, there's no going
Yeah,
back.
except for it is my friend's Overlocker, so it will go
Oh,
back,
too
but
much
I
it.
may it then will be replaced with one of my own.
So sewing swimwear. In preparation for this episode, we listened to all of the sewing podcasts we could get our hands on in order to make sure we had something useful, informative, and most importantly, different to add to the conversation. And I think that we've
Mhm.
achieved that. We'll add in the show notes the links to the other episodes we think are worth listening to. But we also both made our own swimsuits. So I've made two. I made one on a class that I attended at Fabric Godmother. And then since then, I've made one on my own.
And I've made one swimsuit with 2 different top options on my sewing machine, and I've also partially crocheted a vintage-inspired swimsuit pattern to test out a completely different strategy, but more on that later on. Our tagline is "Home sewing meets high fashion," and I think swimwear is a great topic that intersects both because, as we discovered while making our own swimwear, it's definitely a specialty area of sewing and garment construction. I wanted to kick us off with patterns because while I found that, yes, there are tons and tons online, I also thought the options were fairly limited compared with what you can purchase from ready to wear. But I do think, having successfully made my first two piece, that this would be a great thing to just trace an existing shape or pattern for if you're like me and struggling to find a pattern that you like.
So what pattern did you make in the last month then,
So
Rebecca?
I made the Paradise Patterns Cowrie Kini, and I followed maybe 90% of the pattern to the letter. And which pattern did you make, Tracy?
Well, I just want to say that 90% of the pattern is completely following a pattern is
I
completely
mean, I
unlike
told you
me.
I thought it was kind of like pulling teeth, but I do think doing my first swimwear, it was very helpful to have.
It's better than winging
Absolutely.
it completely.
Absolutely. I learned some things.
Well, I made the Megan Nielsen Cotter
Mm.
Slow. But what I absolutely loved about sewing up swimwear is that it's really quick to do. So for a swimsuit, you can do it in as little as 3 pieces of fabric. You don't need to iron the fabric. So once everything is cut out, you can sit at your machine and just sew up a
I
swimsuit.
couldn't agree more. It really was a quick and pretty painless process.
Yeah. And then once you have a pattern that works for you, it's like really customizable. You want a higher rise, amend it. You want tie straps, amend it. You want a lower back, amend it. You want a cutout, amend it. And I really would like to make myself a strapless one piece for sunbathing, not for
Mhm.
swimming. I don't think that's very
Mhm.
practical. And I'm confident that I can just hack a pattern to make that work for me with, a pattern that works. It's just a really nice thing to customize once you've got it down.
Absolutely. But those first patterns can be so helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are lots of patterns out there. So some of note: Friday Pattern Company, Classic Core Patterns, Tilly and the Buttons, and Megan Nielsen, because they always have really excellent instructions and sew-alongs to help hold your hand through making your first swimsuit. But outside of that, there are lots of patterns out there. I think it's just about finding what you want in terms of your style. And I guess in terms of picking a passion, it is down to personal preference in terms of the style and the support and the cover up that you want from your swimsuit.
Yep. I think that two really important things to consider are, first, are you actually going swimming in it? Or is it more of a lounge activity? And then the bust support to make you feel comfortable while doing that activity. The function for the suit really can dictate not only the pattern that you might need, but also the style of fabric. According to the Love to Sew podcast, there are three enemies for swimwear: sun, salt, and chlorine.
And I think you have to add sun cream into that
Ooh,
as well.
does sunscreen also break down the fiber in your suit?
It can definitely ruin your swimwear. Yeah. It can stain it and stuff as well, can't it?
So I guess depending on which of these things you plan on encountering while wearing your swimsuit, you might need to have more specialized fabric versus if you're simply lounging in your bathing suit. The general rule is four-way stretch is required for a comfortable fit, and sadly, no natural fibers in your suit fabric as they can hold water. I'm still on
Mm.
course to complete a crochet swimsuit this summer, but sadly, I'm less optimistic about its functionality now that I have learned that cotton is the enemy when it comes to swimwear, sadly, and there is a fairly high cotton content in that. Such a bummer.
Well, I'm sure it'll look great, just not for actual
Yeah.
swimming.
And Tracy, I know in London there are, of course, a lot of options for specialty fabric, but near my home in Germany, when I asked at my local shop for swim material, I just got a four-way stretch lycra, and that's fine for my intended use for swimwear. Um, you may have to get a bit more specialized if you're an avid swimwear or frequent holiday maker.
But there is quite a lot of availability of swimwear fabric online. Lots and lots of stores stock this beautiful dead stock swimwear, and you'll find it because it'll be marketed as swimwear. And this is one of the times where shopping dead stock is good, because otherwise it's hard to find sustainable options. You'll find that some of the swimwear fabric is made from recycled polyester and all sorts, and so you can make some good choices in terms of the swimwear that you buy.
Absolutely. So, in addition to specialized fabric, there are also specialized elastics to use when sewing your swimwear.
Yes, and you need a lot of elastic
Mhm.
when you're sewing swimwear. So for swimwear, the elastic you want to use is a type of swimwear rubber or woven swim elastic. And the swimwear rubber feels a bit like, the old school swim hats that you'd get. It kind of feels a bit like that. So rubber elastic is really good because it's resistant to salt water and chlorine and sun cream, and so it'll make your swimwear last longer. It's more stable and won't degrade over time. Woven swim elastic is also available, but doesn't have quite the same amount of recovery to it as you'll find with rubber elastic. The reason you want to use a specialist swimwear elastic is because regular elastic won't last as long as the special swimwear elastic. So if you intend on wearing your swimsuit lots and actually using it as a swimsuit, then you want to make sure that you're using the correct elastic. And one of the tips that I picked up on the class, which I'd like to share with you, is to label up your elastics in biro once you've cut them out, because it's really easy to get mixed up with all the elastics because there's quite a lot of elastic. And similarly, when you're marking up like halfway marks or quarter marks on the elastic, if you do it with a biro, because you don't want pin marks in your elastic because it can cause problems to the elasticity of the
Tracy,
elastic.
what is a biro?
Oh, pen.
Just like a normal
Huh.
pen?
It's just a pen. It's a
Ballpoint
ballpoint.
pen?
There you go. Biro. It's just how
Learn something
funny.
new every day.
How funny. It's so funny, isn't it? I've worked with my US colleagues for like decades, coming up on decades now, and there's still every now and then there'll still be a phrase and they'll be like,
Yeah.
what's that mean? There we
And I'm
go.
just like, what is this magical tool? And you're like, a ballpoint pen? Like, no, that's a great point, Tracy. I clip mine with different colored clips in order to not get them confused.
Oh, that's a good technique.
Yeah, and
Yep.
some of my lengths were actually almost identical too for different aspects. So I
Mhm.
clipped them with different colors and then left them in different parts of the room. My Karikini also had a fold over elastic feature to it as well, which was also recommended that it be more of a specialty elastic. However, I don't think mine was, but It still is a lovely finish to have on a suit, but can make for more challenging of sewing, especially when you're doing the clasp and folding over that part of the swimsuit back ended up meaning that you had to sew through 6 layers of elastic. So that was really challenging.
Doesn't sound good.
No, those are really ugly stitches, but they hold, so we're fine. So sizing is fairly straightforward, I would say. Don't you agree, Tracy? You agree.
Well, yes. I think, yeah, like most patterns have really nuanced size charts to follow, and your fabric has lots of stretch. So it's one of the few times where a good fit should be a bit easier to achieve. But I think it also depends on what you're making, because like a one piece without cups, for example, is going to be much easier to fit than one where you're putting in cups or putting in proper underwires. So, for example, I think the Sophie swimsuit pattern from Closet Cool Patterns has underwires in it. So you want a proper fit on that. And that's something you'd want to take a bit more time on fishing. But for a one piece, it's quite straightforward, I think.
No, I think that absolutely makes sense. I did run into an issue with sizing on the swimsuit that I made, and I
Oh.
wanted to make a note on adjusting swimwear patterns. So I
Mhm.
usually do have to adjust the rise on trousers. That any trouser that I make, I just have a short torso, but for some reason I decided to just make the pattern as is and see if I still needed to do the adjustment at the end. And unfortunately, I did. So there are two options that are recommended if you need to do a rise adjustment. One is simply to size down. You lose some width, but you also lose that length in the rise. And with the right size elastic and stretchy fabric, that really might not be an issue to size down. In my case, the waist of the briefs fit really nicely, but where all the fabric kind of hits and sits on the rear just doesn't work. I have to pull it about like halfway up my back to get it to lay the way it's supposed to. So in this case, I really should have shortened the crotch piece by several centimeters in order to get a better fit. And that should have been done before I attached the lining. I think there's a really clear opportunity to make that adjustment, especially when you're looking at adjusting the bottoms before the lining gets attached to the main piece. And I think that's exactly what I should have put them on and made a decision to shorten it. Like a good way to check is, we wear underwear every day in theory,
Mm.
and you know what
Mhm.
your underwear looks like. And so you kind of want your bottoms to look similar-ish to what
Mhm.
your underwear might look like and what you find comfortable. So if you do something like I did where you make it and you hold it up and go, "Those look a lot longer than what I'm used to seeing every day," then you might wanna make an adjustment.
Makes sense. So that brings us then on to swimwear linings. So swimwear linings are a bit different than other garment linings because you want it to have the same properties as your swimsuit. So it could be in the same fabric as your swimsuit. It could be special swimsuit lining fabric, or you might want to use something with a bit more support, like power mesh. And some patterns allow power mesh as an additional support. So, for example, the one I made, you can have a shelf bra made in power mesh, which gives you a bit more support. But you'll also, when working with your swimsuit, you can make a decision about whether you actually want to line it. If your fabric's quite thick, you can get away without lining it. But if it's quite a pale fabric or it's quite thin, you might want to line it in nude fabric and nude swimwear fabric. So there's lots of things you can play around with. And that's one of the things where it's quite useful to look at your own swimwear
Mm,
and see how they're all slightly different. Some are lined, some aren't. Some have,
yeah.
extra support, others don't. So it's there's lots of things you can do and play around
That's a
with.
great point. And everyone mentions this, but I think it stands repeating that swimwear fabric is incredibly slippery. So it isn't something that you want to cut on a fold. And I really appreciated that advice that I had heard before I actually cut mine out because the pattern did say cut on a fold. And I didn't do that since I had heard otherwise. Instead, you either want to flip your pattern along that fold line after you've cut one half and cut the other half, or even potentially trace your pattern onto another piece of paper that is the full pattern piece size to eliminate the need to fold up the fabric. Because if it's in two layers, it's just not going to be a clean cut.
Yeah, absolutely. You really, really want to cut it out in a single
Mhm.
layer.
Another thing on cutting out your pattern is this is not a good time to use your book as a weight. I'd love it for every other time, but Tracy, I was envious of your delightful little pattern weight washers when I went to cut out the swimwear, since all of the pieces were incredibly tiny.
Yeah, yeah, you definitely want some small small weights.
And I did use some small weights ultimately, 3-pounders. And then lastly, on cutting out, I'm usually not a rotary cutter fan since I am usually sewing with thicker fabrics and they just aren't great for cutting lots of layers at once. But I absolutely fell in love with my rotary cutters when working with the Lycra. So much easier to cut those small curves without stretching anything out. I am absolutely a convert. Although we should also mention that rotary cutters are better used on a table and a cutting mat rather than on the floor. So do like Tracy and I did and kick your partner out of the house so you can take over the kitchen with your sewing project.
Yeah, I think that it's the perfect use of kitchen
Yeah,
island. Much
absolutely.
better. Much better use of the kitchen island. But yeah, I agree. The rotary cutter is really
Mhm.
great for cutting out swimwear because you get nice clean lines and it's really quick to
And
do.
as much as you think you aren't moving it, even if your scissors are really precise, it's still just not as clean.
No, it's definitely a good use of the rotary
Absolutely.
cutter.
A lot of the nitty-gritty of sewing swimwear, I feel like, is well documented in a lot of places, but I have to say, I absolutely love discovering and using my triple step zigzag on my machine for the final top stitch. It has a superior staying strength since it's 3 short stitches to make that one zigzag stitch and uses a bit more thread, but it also just has a really lovely stretch to it, and it looks so nice.
Yeah, it is a nice finish. It looks very professional, doesn't it? Nice and
Yeah.
clean. Another type of stitch that I want to try out on the next bit of swimwear that I make is using my twin needle, so you get some nice parallel lines on the top stitching of all the edges. I'll report back on that.
That also sounds like that would be a lovely finishing, and definitely something, we can
Yeah,
start playing around with now that we feel comfortable making our
yeah,
swimwear.
absolutely.
Now, speaking of clean finishings, one thing I wish someone would have told me before I started making swimwear is exactly what we discussed on, I think it was Sunday night, Tracy. I had stitched together the majority of the top of the swimsuit, and I was slightly mortified because I think we both pride ourselves on garment construction and appearance of that construction. We talk about couture finishings and all of these things. And with swimwear, you need to throw all of that out the window. Tracy, do you mind repeating what you had said to me? I thought that was really great.
Well, I'm ashamed to say, but on the class that I attended, it looked like some of the worst sewing of my life. It's like completely ashamed, ashamed of my sewing. They reassured me, and they were like, "Look, because it's stretchy, you can't tell when it's on," and it's absolutely true. It like stretches out beautifully when it's on, and you can't tell how terribly my zigzag stitching truly looked.
I mean, I think that's one of the points it doesn't look terrible. I think it's just something we're not used to seeing very often is like a gathered elastic stitch. And yeah, so it was very helpful. Thank you, Tracy, for telling me that it's okay to have it not look absolutely perfect when you're done sewing it because it does stretch out, especially those really gathered seam lines with elastic underneath. And yeah.
Yeah.
So just having the confidence that and I do have to say I was surprised by how well mine turned out considering midway I was like this is the ugliest thing I've ever made my entire life and now it looks nice. So just have a little bit of confidence and kind of ditch that perfectionism. You'll be fine.
Absolutely. And it's a quick sew, so you can find out how good it is
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
quite quickly. So when we started this episode, we posed the question of, do you need an overlocker in order to sew swimwear? And I think we have a clear answer that you don't.
A standard sewing machine works wonderfully, and this fabric isn't going to unravel on its own. So, no overlocker needed at all.
Yeah, you don't need to worry about finishing the seams. So it's more about just lots and lots of zigzag
Yeah,
stitches.
getting that elastic secure and hidden. A note on caring for your garments. Since we talked about all of these things that could potentially damage your swimwear, you want to make sure that how you are taking care of it isn't one of those things that's damaging it. A long time ago, I was told that heat and elastic don't mix. That's why if you regularly tumble dry activewear or even denim with a decent amount of stretch to it, you'll notice over time the recovery and stretch of the fabric starts to go. And that's because those fibers are breaking down. So don't dry your swimwear.
Yes. Whenever you go to a gym or, swimming pool, sometimes they have their drying machines, don't they? Give it a good rinse, get all the
Yeah.
chlorine out and put it in a nice little bag. Take it home and dry it naturally.
Treat it like you would lingerie, like nice lingerie.
Yeah, especially if you put time into making it and it fits
Yes.
perfectly. You want to look
Yes.
after it. Now, we did tease a segment on dry robes. So dry robes are a weatherproof changing robe, which I think in certain parts of the UK have morphed into just normal coats that people wear. But it's a fast drying and super warm inner fleece lining in a weather resistant outer shell. So with a hood and stuff, so it can be worn all weather. So it's ideal if you're doing lots of outdoor, open water swimming or coming out of the sea with a wetsuit on. It's something that allows you to warm up and change.
So my perspective, Tracy, if I can Americanize
Go
this,
for it.
it basically looks like a very large parka with
Yes.
like a terry robe lining. So it's kind
Yeah.
of like an outdoor snuggie, but in the best way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Exactly that.
I think it
Exactly
makes
that.
so much sense because there is so much cold water swimming in the UK.
Yeah.
I guess in Washington State, where I'm from too, that's coastal, there's ocean. So if you are going swimming, a simple towel afterwards isn't gonna do. So that's what this would be for.
Exactly that. Exactly that. Yeah. 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 So if you've got lots of cold swimming planned, then it's quite a nice thing to have. Now, they are quite expensive to buy, which makes sense because of the sheer amount of fabric that's in
Mhm.
them. You could make your own. And I think because it's quite a simple shape, a simple pattern, in that it's a big oversized coat. So if you were to make your own, you want an outer layer, which is like a waterproof fabric, and then you want, depending on the thickness of your inner shell, you might want another layer of lining, like a kind of
Is it a fleece or is it like a terry toweling?
like a terry
Yeah.
toweling or a sherpa,
Oh, it's
something that's
amazing.
going to be quick to dry but nice and snugly. And yeah, so you might want a fleece layer in between if both the inside and outside layer are quite thin, or if you're using it in particularly cold weather. But yeah, your inside one, you want something because it's going to be against your skin, so you want something nice and soft. Hack a simple pattern and have a go. I reckon it will be quite a nice addition to a cold beach.
Or simple everyday wear. I'm a fan of that too.
Absolutely.
Rainy dog walks, all of the things. Yes.
Exactly.
Well, while there is nothing more high fashion than a dry robe, clearly, I was thinking about the high fashion aspect of swimwear. And there's a high fashion use for swimwear that I think is absolutely worth discussing, and that is swimwear as everyday wear. We've all
Mm.
seen countless editorial spreads out there with a flowing skirt over a one piece, a high waisted pair of trousers with bikini top, and an open weave shirt. The key idea here is the versatility that swimwear can have in your wardrobe, especially when it's hot out and you're going to be sweating. You could view this as a more conservative take potentially on the underwear as outerwear trend of recent, but there isn't anything new in this either. A quick Pinterest search will pull up editorials from the 50s, even through the 70s, and you'll see this kind of styling out and about all over the place.
Yeah.
If you asked me if I would ever sew a bodysuit, I would say absolutely not. I spent enough time in leotards in my younger life, thank you. But I love wearing a visible swimsuit as a layer in the summertime. So this idea of
Mm.
styling swimwear as your everyday wear is evident in a lot of modern designers' work. One that springs to mind is Christopher Esber, who's a great example of the kind of jewelry mixed with swimwear trend. A visual for you, picture a one piece with a fabulous cutout, but the joining piece between some of the cutouts are statement metallic pieces, almost like jewelry. But a side note, I did check what they're made out of, and they are plastic because otherwise, ouch, in the sun if they were actually metallic. I did check.
Yeah, yeah, you
Yep,
don't wanna
no.
burn. Nope.
These swimwear adornments are absolutely gorgeous, but not necessarily meant for exclusively swimming. In fact, Christopher Esbear has a swimsuit with three of these gorgeous metallic-ish ring details that also comes in a dress version in exactly the same fabric.
Mhm.
So, if you weren't sure if it was worth tackling a swimwear project because, like me, you don't go swimming that often, perhaps it's worth doing for a summer high fashion statement with a bias cut ankle length skirt the next time you're at a garden party, or with a pair of knee length city shorts and an open crocheted shirt the next time you're doing some urban exploring.
Mhm.
Now I'm inspired to make a one piece swimsuit and find a garden party to go to. And speaking of makes, Tracy, what are you working on next?
Well, we've had a great discussion on how eager we are to dive into summer wardrobe sewing, but also how challenging it can be to figure out what those right pieces
It
are.
is a hard season to dress for, but I also think there's so much opportunity to identify and fill really important gaps in your wardrobe through those makes when done really thoughtfully and intentionally.
Yeah, it's the perfect theme for our next episode. So, next month, we will be discussing how to elevate your summer wardrobe through summer sewing. We will cover how to identify the most impactful items to add to your closet that you will reach for again and again.
We'll cover summer staples, inspiration for your summer makes, the concept of uniform dressing without being boring, and of course, tips for how to minimize your environmental impact along the way.
So, I guess if you want to find out what we are making next, you'll just have to tune in next month. In the meantime, I'm Tracy,
And I'm Rebecca, and this has been
the Threaded Together podcast.
See You
See you
Next
next
Time.
time. Looking forward to our next episode in a month. Make sure you give us the thumbs up on Apple Podcast or follow us on Spotify. You can find more details on what we discussed today in the show notes below or on threadedtogetherpodcast.com. And for more behind the scenes and regular updates, you can find us on all social media channels at Threaded Together Podcast.